Very proud to welcome Mr. Talmiz Ahmad, an IFS officer of the batch of 1974. He has been posted in West Asian countries like Kuwait, Iraq and Yemen, and later as Consul General in Jeddah. He has also held positions in the Indian missions in New York, London and Pretoria. He has served as the Indian ambassador to Saudi from the years 2000 to 2003 and 2010 to 2011 and Oman and United Arab Emirates. He was also the Additional Secretary for International Cooperation in Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas from the years 2004 to 2006. In July 2011, Saudi government confirmed on him the King Abdul Aziz Medal First Class for his contribution to promotion of Indo-Saudi relationships. Apart from being a diplomat, he is also a prolific writer and he has penned 3 books: Reform in the Arab World, External Influences and Regional Debates, The Children of Abraham at War, Clash of Messianic Militarism, and Islamic Challenge in West Asia, Doctrinal and Political Competitions after the Arab Spring. He writes and lectures on frequently in political Islam, politics of West Asia and energy security issues. We would also like to thank the Department of Public Diplomacy, Ministry of External Affairs to help us host this session. Sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be amongst you. It's always a pleasure for us to engage with young people who are going to occupy senior positions in our corporate sector and beyond. Just a quick word as to why interactions like this are useful. This is all linked with one word. It's called globalization. Globalization has exposed India to a multiplicity of interactions and engagements. And there is a crying demand for Indian professionals in different parts of the world. And there, if you go to the Middle East, over the last few years, the presence of Indian professionals has really increased. And there is, you have Indian engineers, Indian managers, Indian accountants in very good numbers. So there is a requirement to be familiar with the international milieu. There is another important reason, and that is that India also is globally engaged. We are today a rising power. Certainly in the 21st century, we will be playing a significant role in Asian and regional and world affairs. Our councils will be listened to with respect. There are all kinds of significant changes that are taking place in the international environment, and we have to be part of it. We have to be familiar with it. We will be functioning within that milieu. Hence, an exposure to foreign affairs should not be confined only to the mandarins of South Bloc. It should be a matter of deep interest to all people who are well educated and interested in an international perspective. Sadly, our own media doesn't give us the exposure that we need. If you are going to be a regional and global player, educated people must have exposure to what is happening. You will find that our papers are so consumed with domestic matters, which are of course important, but that it has been at the expense of international exposure. So I would suggest, with all humility, that do take some time off and wherever possible, get to know what is happening in other parts of the world. Not that, most of our sources tend to be Western sources. The Indian discourse and Indian writing is still very, very nascent. And therefore, I always tell people that, we have Time, Newsweek, of course now Newsweek is gone, so Time, Newsweek, Financial Times, BBC and CNN, a totality of Anglo-American sources. And Indian discourse is emerging, but still at a nascent stage, as I said. We don't have enough writers on foreign affairs. So be it, this is just a kind of alert to you that it is important, it's an integral part of your own personal growth to be familiar with matters that are happening in our region. There is something very important about West Asia. Very quickly, you have heard the term the Arab world. The Arab world basically refers to a sort of territory that stretches from Morocco to Yemen. But it is broadly, very broadly, for historic reasons, you could think of it in terms of three sub-regions. The Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, which is right next door to us. Then you have West Asia, or traditionally referred to as the Levant, which is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, etc. And then you have North Africa. Now, these are not regions which are cut off from each other. There is a very clear line which says this is one region, that's another. More and more there is an integrity. You find in the location of, say, Egypt, which is the political, cultural and economic capital of this region, a very influential center, it straddles many of these divides. But there is a certain historical background to this division that I mentioned. The Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula tended to be historically dominated by the British. The Levant was dominated by the Anglo-French, particularly after the First World War. And North Africa, other than Egypt, which was under British influence, North Africa was then under French colonial rule. So this is because of this historic background over the last 150 years, that a certain, you could say, a certain complexity has emerged in an otherwise, in the environment which was till 200 years earlier used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, something very important is taking place in our region. Whatever you see happening is linked to certain arrangements that were put in place just after the First World War. These are known as the Versailles arrangements. So there were a series of arrangements over 4 or 5 years, put to collectively referred to as the Versailles arrangements. In the Second World War, 2 decisions were taken by the then principal colonial powers, France and England, and they were in 2 documents. One document is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was secret, and the other was the Balfour Declaration, which was declared, which came out in 1918. The Sykes-Picot Agreement divided Arabia as part of the mandates which would be influenced by and governed by France and England. So the entire territory of the Arab world in the Levant, which had been promised freedom by the British as the price for their agitation, their support to the British against Turkey, which some of you would have seen in the film Lawrence of Arabia, were actually secretly going to be divided between these 2 colonial powers, so that the Ottoman rule was going to be taken over by the Anglo-French alliance. This was the first agreement, the principal betrayal. And then separately, based on a series of private consultations, the British government decided that in the heart of the Arab world, they would create a Jewish homeland. This was the Balfour Declaration. So this is exactly what happened. Following from this, a series of arrangements were put in place. Countries were given shape. Certain rulers were placed at the head of these countries. And a certain structure then emerged. A pattern then emerged. And this pattern was that the colonial rule in this region would continue. And that this region would have rulers who would be beholden more to the Western alliance than to the interests of their own people. They were under no circumstances to be truly free. This was the first realistic consequence. What was the reason for this? The reason was, of course, there is the mindset of colonial and imperialist grandeur. You feel good if you occupy other territories. But there was, in the case of the British, certain strategic value as well. As you know, the British had always controlled the Gulf. Right from the 18th century, the Gulf had Indian stations, Indian offices. In the 19th century, they were structured as political agencies and political residences. These were staffed by British officers from India. So they were this was an extension of the British Indian Empire. The British interest was that no foreign ruler, no foreign player should emerge in the Gulf because it is on the route to India. So it would threaten British interests in India if you had an alien rule, initially the French and later then later the Russians. The Russians as part of the great game, the Russians were coming southwards, perhaps seeking the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. So they had to be blocked, and that is part of the great game. So this territory had to be controlled by the British. This was the first interest. In 1912, the British Navy shifted from coal to oil. And while the British had a lot of coal, they had no oil. Therefore, they had to politically control those regions, those countries that had oil. And this was Iran initially, in those days called Persia. So the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was set up. 50% of this company was owned by the British government. Later, in terms of the Versailles arrangements, Iraq was given shape, the modern shape of Iraq, because Kirkuk and Mosul were found to have oil. Therefore, oil became a very important factor in the presence of Western rulers in this region. Therefore, this pattern of having rulers firstly defining the countries, having rulers who were subservient to Western interests, and the strategic interest of oil, that pattern continued throughout the 20th century. Even after the Second World War, when the British could no longer have any imperialist illusions, they handed over these interests to the Americans. So the Americans then dominated hegemonically and strategically this entire region. What was their interest? Their interest was, number one, to ensure the smooth flow of petroleum from the region. Number two, to ensure that no other alien power dominated the region. And number three, the security of Israel. How did they achieve these interests? They set up a series of engagements with the principal rulers of these territories, all of them authoritarian rulers. They were of two kinds. There were traditional rulers who claimed legitimacy on the basis of inherited right. They were usually of tribal origin, and therefore their ancestors had been tribal chiefs, and through a series of war and political engagement, they were able to consolidate their rule. So these were the most important supporters of Western influence. There were in some countries, and at various times, revolts or coup d'etat, as a result of which traditional rulers were done away with and authoritarian regimes emerged. At that stage, Western diplomacy had to ensure that even these rulers, the results of coup d'etat, were also supportive of Western interests. So this pattern broadly continued. There was a big shock in the early 1970s when the Arab regimes which controlled the oil of the Gulf at that time declared an embargo against Iran, against the United States, and the price of oil steadily increased. But having done this, recognizing that the main market for this oil was the West, this kind of standoff was quickly given up, and the robust, mutually beneficial relationship was put in place. Now, what was the scenario that we are looking at before the Arab Spring? The scenario was made up of authoritarian rulers who was usually more subservient to the interests of their owners, of their Western masters, than their own people. This was the first thing. Therefore, as a result, what you find is that no political growth took place in this region. From 1947, after India's independence, slowly but surely, other countries in Asia started becoming free, and many of them became democratic. So that by the end of the century, almost all of them had some degree of political or popular participation. Separately, from the early 1990s, in Latin America, you started having major winds of change, and the old dictators got replaced by democratically elected governments. In Africa, particularly after South Africa's freedom and the emergence of the Rainbow Nation, you found slowly but surely a certain progress in favor of popular participation. Not so in the Arab world. The Arab world was excluded from this political evolution, to the extent that some people started saying that there is something inherently wrong with either the religion that the people follow, Islam is not compatible with democracy, or there is something wrong with these people who are Arab, that the Arabs cannot countenance democracy. Every other community in the world could. The Buddhist, the Hindu, the Catholic, the Protestant, all of them could be democratic. But there was something inherently flawed about Arab character and the religion that they followed. This was the kind of rubbish with which imperialism sought to, it sought to affirm the legitimacy of their domination in this region. These other things that were happening is, of course, I have mentioned oil, I have mentioned that Israel had emerged. Now, when Israel emerged in 1948, it was seen as a very great catastrophe for the Arab people. And then the defeat of the Arab armies in 1967 more or less completed that particular challenge to the creation of Israel. And this left the entire region in a state of deep malaise, of deep depression, of being dismayed, of being defeated, of being left out of the mainstream of the international movement, of not being in control of their own destiny. And this was the situation that constituted the reality of the political environment. Now, I must mention to you that attempts were made all through the 20th century to throw off the colonial yoke. It was always unsuccessful because the colonial yoke was supported by the local ruler. So the local ruler saw no reason why he should participate in this anti-colonial struggle, because then he would lose his seat as well. So finally, and most terribly, you had a recourse to radical Islam. Radical Islam emerged from the global jihad, which was organized in Afghanistan by United States, South Africa, Saudi Arabia. It was supposed to be a mobilization of the revolt of people against Soviet occupation. It was to have a short-term tactical life. Nobody thought that once there was victory against the Soviet Union, that this would have a value and resonance of its own. And therefore, to this day, we are still living with the consequences of that short-sighted mobilization that was done in 1980s, all through the 90s. It was a successful jihad. It was the first great victory of Muslim people against colonialism, against the Russian. And not only was the Soviet Union defeated, it then broke up. I mean, what more could you ask of the good Lord? He was truly supporting the jihad. And if he could support the jihad in Afghanistan, then surely he would strengthen Muslim arms against the other enemies you had, the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy were the authoritarian regimes who were beholden to Western powers and Israel, and the far enemy, the root cause of all the malaise, was the United States itself. This is the background that led to the assault upon the United States in 9/11. They decided that instead of assaulting the near enemy and getting beaten up due to state violence, let us assault the far enemy, and on the basis of that assault, mobilize huge support across the Muslim territories and then take on the near enemy. Unfortunately, what happened is, while that assault was remarkably dramatic and successful, it did not lead to the mobilization that had been anticipated. The Al-Qaeda became primarily a terrorist organization. It indulged in mindless violence. It had no strategic value. It was attacking women and children. And the consequence of this was that more and more Islam and Muslim people were being looked at in very negative terms. This is, therefore, even well before the death of Osama bin Laden, the resonance that radical Islam had earlier had begun to wane away. And the region was looking for an alternative for, they needed to have significant political change. They needed an alternative to their scenario. And this is what emerged in the shape of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, when it occurred, to strike a personal note, there had been agitation in Tunisia in the middle of December. And because there had been sporadic demonstrations in different parts of the Arab world from time to time, I, who was then in Riyadh as ambassador, did not take much attention, pay much attention. But suddenly Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali landed in Jeddah. So he landed in my jurisdiction, so this became my problem. And suddenly I looked at the Arab Spring with deep interest. I recognized that this is something very extraordinary, very dramatic that has taken place in the Arab world, and it is something that is worthy of intense analysis and study. And this is what happened. Now the first time I wrote my first dispatch for the ministry, I was searching for words because it was so dramatic that I could not just use ordinary prose that is there, that is the stuff of our dispatches. So I went to the Tale of Two Cities, and these are the first paragraph of the Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, where he describes the sensation relating to the French Revolution. A sense of exultation on the one hand, and a sense of fear on the other. That is this really happening? Is this dramatic change actually there? And therefore I could not do better than this first paragraph from the Tale of Two Cities, which I thought captured my own sense of what was happening at that time. And then of course I looked at another poet, he's a Tunisian poet, who used poetry to explain what was happening. This was a poem that was written by this revolutionary poet in the context of French colonialism, but it got quoted once again in the context of the French Revolution. And you will find that many of this poem has a lot of resonance with the kind of patriotic poetry that was being written in India. There is a famous poem of George Maliabadi, क्या हिंद का ज़ंदा काँप रहा है, टूट रही है, थकती है, उगता है शायद कुछ कह दी और तोड़ रही है ज़ंजीरें. Almost the same sentiment of joy that you are breaking your chains and getting out of the prison where you have been interred for so long. Now, what was the background to all this? See, there was a serious economic malaise. The economic malaise, usually in an authoritarian order, the benefits of economic activity normally are confined to a small coterie of the rulers and the groups around him, his family members and their friends. They are the ones who benefit. They are the ones who get the big contracts, they are the ones who get the commissions, they are the ones who live off the wealth of their country. And there was rampant unemployment. Now this unemployment is a very debilitating experience because it not only denies you economic sustenance, it robs you of your dignity as well. And therefore you had a large number of people, well qualified, well educated, with foreign degrees, who were doing menial work. And even that, because it was unlicensed, you could not carry it on. And contrast this with the opulence of the rulers and the coterie with them. So this was the origin, the corruption. Unemployment on the one hand and corruption on the other. And it is in this context that the demand came for transparency. Demand came for accountability. And when you speak of accountability and transparency, you are just one step away from demanding popular participation in the political process. And this is what happened. And I have given a quotation just to give you a sense of what was happening in those intoxicating days. This is a quotation from a Saudi paper produced from Dammam, which is a business center, oil and business center. And there is a sense that something very important, very special is taking place. Note that the author does not distinguish between traditional monarchies and the various military dictators. For him, he looks at the malaise of the Arab world and he says that there is something very important happening and that the region will not be the same again. Now, where are we at this time? Firstly, what is the pattern? What I noticed when I saw that how the Arab Spring continued, I noticed that there were public agitations, particularly in those countries where already there was some experience of street activity. As you know, very often military dictators enjoy the spectacle of popular support by organizing demonstrations on the streets. So the people have an experience of coming out on the street in large number, and this was the case in these four countries that I have mentioned, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria and Libya, that people actually came out on the streets. There are many other countries, particularly in the Gulf, which have no such experience. There is no experience of coming out on the street. But they had one other experience, and that experience was that their traditional monarchies used to have some kind of election. It's a bogus election. It had no democratic value at all. But the fact that people could come out, stand in a queue and put their vote in a ballot box led to the demand for political reform on the basis of that this vote should now count, that the assemblies that we have, which are toothless, should now be empowered. So a combination of street experience and ballot experience came together in a whole range of countries where people started demanding political change. And then I have put down three countries which I have called politically inert, where you had neither the experience of voting nor did you have experience of street demonstrations. There's Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the UAE. Qatar and UAE have very small native populations. In these countries, the Indians are the overwhelming majority. We are more than 30% in UAE, and the local population is about 15%. So I won't even, I look at these two countries as basically international enclaves. So they are not supposed to have significant political activity anyway. But the real story, the real narrative is about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is truly, it's a proper country. It's not an enclave. It's not just an oil producer. It is a country the size, it is 2/3 the size of India. It has 28 million people, of whom 8 million are foreigners. It has an upper class, an upper middle class, a middle class, a lower middle class, and a lower class. It has extremely rich people and extremely poor people, and all in between. It is also a very unique country. It is in that it is ideologically run. It has a politico-religious ideology. Its ideology emerges from a form of Islam that is adhered to by the ruling family. And it is a form of Islam. This ideological base gives legitimacy to the rulers on the one hand, but on the other hand also gives them considerable coercive authority, because it gives you the chance to ensure that while you demand conformity with this broad ideology which is being touted in the name of religion, you also are able to be authoritarian. So it is an authoritarian approach rather than a purely religious approach. Now where are we now? Very quickly, an overview. In the case of Tunisia, you had elections. An Islamic party was victorious, Al-Nahda, that had been banned earlier. But the country is truly polarized. Because while Nahda got a slim majority, there are large sections of the country that were very uncomfortable with an Islamic government. So very, very peacefully, the Islamic government has agreed to step down, go through with a consensual approach, and initially have an apolitical government, and then look out to have perhaps elections at a later date. This has been done very peacefully. So that while the Islamics are in government, their majority is so slim that you leave out large numbers of people. And a country that was under authoritarian rule for more than nearly 40 years, the people do not have the political experience. Neither the Islamics nor the others have the political experience to run a modern state in a democratic system. So very wisely, the ruling Muslim party has decided to take it easy, accommodate the non-Muslim elements, and perhaps arrange for an apolitical government. In the case of Egypt, this did not happen. Again, there the Islamic party is one, that is the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood was set up in 1928. It has extraordinary support. It is in an authoritarian system. It was the only political movement that was extremely well organized, both in terms of its membership, in terms of its reach at the grassroots level, in terms of the institutions that it had all over the country. So it is not surprising that in the first flush of the Arab Spring, it should get a majority. Again, it was a slim majority. The Muslim Brotherhood made the mistake of seeking role in government, seeking a majority in parliament and seeking the presidency. Obviously, they had no experience of government either. But they could not be accommodative. Their leaders tended to be very doctrinal. They were not accommodative. They alienated large sections of their own people, and as a result opened the way for the armed forces, which had facilitated the earlier fall of Hosni Mubarak, now have come and staged a coup d'etat and have taken over the government. In regard to Libya, a very interesting thing happened. There was a popular movement in Benghazi, but this popular movement was very quickly suppressed, and we thought that was the end of it. But Libya is the first place where you had Western intervention, Western military intervention. The Western military intervention in favor of regime change. And therefore you had massive bombardment of Tripoli over several hours, several thousand people were killed, and the political order was destroyed. Gaddafi took refuge in a particular place, he was discovered, and with deep personal humiliation and abuse, he was put to death. This was the regime change. After that, you don't have a government. The country has splintered, large number of warring groups are there, they're referred to as warlords. Different groups dominate different parts of the country, and the central government, the government that emerged in Tripoli as a result of elections, a non-Islamic government, it has no control over the country whatsoever. So the country is now a band of lawless, violent elements who roam around the badlands and seek advantage for themselves by tyrannizing the people. This has also opened the space for the entry into the region of the Al-Qaeda, which I will dilate on in a short while. The other country that is left is Yemen. In the case of Yemen, there was a movement against the president. The president tried to hold out for a long time. He finally abdicated, but he abdicated in favor of his number two. So you had a sort of change without a change of person without change of regime. I mean, the same regime continued. Now, over 2 years that have passed since then, the new president who took over, was earlier vice president, he has attempted to distance himself from the previous ruler and to build up a certain kind of political order. But the country is facing very serious difficulties. As it is, for central authority in the country is weak, but now you have external elements to make their life even more miserable. And therefore you have extremist Al-Qaeda elements who have penetrated into Yemen and have a very strong base. And you have a sort of nascent secessionist movement in the south. You remember at one time there were two countries that came together in 1990. There was the South Yemen, which was the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, a communist country. They merged with North Yemen, the Yemen Arab Republic, to form one country. Now there is a secessionist movement there because there are traditional grievances that our interests have not been fully taken care of by the central government. Be that as it may, it is a country that overall seems to be in a bit of a mess. Now, you had a very major desire for change in Bahrain. But Bahrain has one unique character. It's of course part of the GCC. It is on the border of Saudi Arabia. It's an island on the border of Saudi Arabia. The population is 70% Shia. This, while the rulers are Sunni. Now, the Shia population is Arab. It is not of Iranian origin. The demonstrations that took place in the wake of the Arab Spring were not Shia demonstrations. There was no demand for something that was uniquely Shia. There was a demand for political reform. Indeed, reform that had been promised by the ruler in the year 2000. So they were not demanding something extraordinary out of something new. Saudi Arabia till that time had remained low-key with regard to the Arab Spring. A little disturbed, but relatively low-key, thinking that all these things are happening far away. But when the demand came in Bahrain and demonstrations took place day after day at Pearl Square, Saudi Arabia realized that if there were to be real change in Bahrain, it would have a spillover effect in the rest of the GCC. There would be two consequences of such a change. Number one, there would be demand for political reform across the region, including in Saudi Arabia. Secondly, any political reform in Bahrain would mean the empowerment of the Shia community. So if you empower the Shia community, what about the Shia who are in Saudi Arabia, who are also disadvantaged and who are excluded from the mainstream of national life because of the Wahhabi ideology? They would also demand some degree of empowerment. So the Saudis sent in their armed forces into Bahrain at the invitation of the royal family. The demonstrations were then got rid of. The problem is that 2.5 years later, the problem has not gone away. Demonstrations still continue. There are arrests, there are reports of torture, and the problem has not died away at all. So this is the scenario in Bahrain. In what the Saudis decided to do, concerned about what had happened in Bahrain, is to demonize Iran. Iran, which was the big country across the Gulf waters, is a Shia country. So Saudi Arabia, in order to stem the tide of the Arab Spring within its own territory, demonized Iran, saying that all these activities were being inspired by Iran, and that Iran had a certain hegemonic intention across the region to assert Persian hegemony on the one hand and a sectarian spread. Now the view from Riyadh was that after the regime change in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was removed, a Shia government has emerged in Baghdad representing the majority Shia community. And this has led the Saudis to believe that they are strategically disadvantaged, that Iran has now an outreach that goes up to, that now includes Iraq in its embrace, and it already has a very strong alliance with Syria. So that across the northern Gulf, all the way you have Iran, and you have Iraq, and you have Syria. And this is what gives these people a sense that we have to confront the strategic advantage that Iran now enjoys. And hence, the battleground for this between Saudi Arabia and Iran has become Syria. Syria today is the place which has experienced a civil war in which more than 110,000 people have been killed. A large number of disparate elements have entered the region and are seeking space for themselves. There are 4 different kinds of role players. You have extremist radical elements in the shape of Al-Qaeda who have come across from Iraq. You have other extremist elements who are not associated with the radical movement. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, and you have some renegade armed forces personnel who have come across from the National Army. So several thousand people are to be found in these different militia. There are said to be more than 150 militia, and they move from place to place. The country is disorderly, they indulge in a lot of violence. Wherever they occupy a certain stretch of territory, they impose a certain law of their own. Many of them are thugs and bandits, all of them extremely violent people. And again you have a problem, because this situation is not confined just to the domestic situation. There are external role players supporting different factions. Therefore, you find that the Salafi and the renegade armed forces personnel are being supported by Saudi Arabia. The Brotherhood militia are being supported by Qatar and Turkey. And you have the Al-Qaeda who are getting a lot of support from their brethren across the border in Iraq, from the Sunni brethren in Iraq. So I have already mentioned a number of countries from the neighborhood. You have also Israel that keeps a very sharp eye on what is happening in Syria. If you look at it from the Israeli point of view, if they were able to achieve a regime change, you would be able to cut the lifeline to the Hezbollah, which is a formidable military force. From the Saudi side, if you had a regime change, you would cut the link that Syria has with the Iranians. And of course, from the United States point of view, you would be very happy with anything that disadvantaged Iran. So you have an extraordinary alliance of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States raised against Iran, Syria, and now the Russians have come into the picture as well on the side of the national government in Syria. The Russian concern is that they are opposed to what the Americans are up to. This unilateral use of military force by the Americans is not acceptable. They think it is a source of instability and disorder. They point out to what has happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then Libya, and they believe that this is not done. This is contrary to the rules of international engagement. They also feel that if you continue with this, more and more they are strategically disadvantaged. So they have now come onto the same side as the beleaguered Syrian government. Now, I have just very briefly, and with that I will move on. You must have seen the first fruits of victory of the Arab Spring went to the Islamic groups. Now, Islamic groups or Islamism is important because that is going to reverberate across the region for a long time. Political Islam is the attempt to infuse the doctrines of Islam in the political order. Now, it is very, very vague, and in the book that I have just completed, in my first chapter, I have looked at certain aspects of Islamic political theory and practice and what it might mean for us. But no real serious doctrine has been enunciated. You do find that the Muslim Brotherhood in the last 2 decades of the last century and the beginning of this century, in the last 20, 30 years, have been toying with a certain program, a certain platform, and they were borrowing a lot from the West. So if you look at the program, with equal rights, with freedom, with gender sensitivity, they would not be different from any other political manifesto in a democratic system. But the problem with the Muslim Brotherhood has always been that while they have all this beautiful documentation, their leadership remains quite rigid and doctrinal and used more to conspiracy. After all, for most of their life they have been underground. Most of their life they have been in prison. Most of the time they have been executed. So this hardly makes for a very benign, reform-oriented political system. In time they will get there, but at the moment they are nowhere near it. And hence, Morsi was not very successful in spite of the popular support that he enjoyed. Now, when the Muslim Brotherhood was in government, they attempted to do a lot. But because there was, he had won with a barely 50% majority. Therefore, there was at least 50% of the country was overwhelmingly hostile to him. And as time passed, because people after the revolution want quick change, he was not able to deliver. So a series of people emerged hostile to him. Some were liberal, some were from the armed forces, some were for the GCC. See, the GCC countries led by Saudi Arabia are very hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the alternative Islamic doctrine. It is active in politics and it has the capacity to inspire wide-ranging support. It also has a lot of resonance within Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi top leadership is genuinely concerned about the influence that the Brotherhood would have. So they are extremely hostile to the Brotherhood, and hence they actively supported the armed forces in engineering their coup. Similarly, the Saudis are hostile to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. But there is a break in the ranks because you find Qatar is backing the Brotherhood. The Qataris were running their own independent foreign policy. My own sense was that though the country is so small, it is in the vanguard of pursuing the US interest. The US interest was at that time to co-opt the Brotherhood over a period of time, recognizing its value, rather than be hostile to it. It's far better to bring it on board. And that is what they were attempting to do with the help of Qatar until the Morsi government was overthrown. So that is the background to what happened. The Western countries were a little uneasy about the change that had happened. They were not sure about whether to call it a coup. They are supposed to be opposed to coup d'etat. At the same time, they had to work with the government that has come. Saudi Arabia has 3 deep-seated grievances against its historic ally, the United States. Number one, they feel that the United States should have done more to preserve the presidency of Hosni Mubarak. Secondly, they find that the Americans did not receive the news of the Egyptian coup with the enthusiasm that was desired. And thirdly, the Saudis had truly wanted the Americans to bomb Syria. And the reluctance of the Obama administration to get engaged in one more front in the Arab world and the Muslim world was not something that they were very comfortable with. John Kerry has attempted to bridge some gap. He went to Egypt recently and suggested and promised support to the military rulers. He gave some useless lip service to democracy, saying that we hope there will be elections shortly, but they have re-engaged with the Egyptian armed forces, which they had done over several decades earlier. So this is where we are now. Now, very quickly about Syria. Syria is a country that has got, it is, okay, 80% Sunni. It has other minorities, but the ruling clique is from one very peculiar community known as the Alawi. The Alawi were accepted neither as Shia nor as Sunni. But in the 1980s, a Shia cleric recognized them as a Shia community. Though its doctrines are secret, and not all their doctrines correspond with the Shia doctrines of Iran, they are now seen as Shia. In any case, as far as the Saudis were concerned, they were seen as Shia. And therefore it is said that getting rid of a Shia regime and installing in its place a non-Shia regime would be a strategic advantage. The main concern that now from the Syrian side, the initial attempt was made to co-opt the Syrian government onto the Arab side, to get them back into the Arab fold against Iran. But Bashar al-Assad had this important point. What are you giving me back in return? Are you giving me back Golan Heights, which the Israelis have illegally occupied since '67? The answer was they couldn't persuade the Israelis to do that. He said, absent that, I lose everything. Today I have a strategic value because of my link with the Iranians. What do I gain in return? I gain nothing in return. Therefore, he refused to accept the blandishments of the Saudis and the Americans, and as a result, the Saudis then decided to effect regime change through the various groups that are operating there. I won't burden you with a long history and background. But you see, the problem is you have a whole variety of people who are now competing for attention and space in that beleaguered country. As I said, 110,000 people have already been killed in different parts. Ancient cities have been destroyed, large numbers of people killed in this horrible environment. Chemical weapons have also been used. And you have a dreadful scenario of a civil war that sees no possible solution. The only solution that is possible is that the principal sponsors of the movements of the various opposition parties, they arrange something between the two of them, that is Saudi Arabia and Iran. At this stage, that seems like a very, very long shot, and therefore we are seen to be condemned to a prolonged war in that country. Now, as I said that in the case of Syria, it is not just a domestic issue. The regional players are already there, and I have also mentioned that there is now a competition between United States and Russia, and therefore people are now talking about a new Cold War taking shape around the Syrian imbroglio, and that this could have a longer term implications and could be divided, could be a divisive force in world affairs if not managed better in the short term, in the short to medium term. So where do we go from here? Now the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, many people are very despondent. And they are despondent because all of us want wonderful things to happen. Unfortunately, with revolutions, very rarely wonderful things happen immediately. If you were to recall the French Revolution led to the Reign of Terror, it led to the dictatorship of Napoleon, it led to 20 years of warfare and the defeat of France and the restoration of the monarchy. So what happened to the French Revolution? So then again, Russian Revolution. No revolution has ever been peaceful or has ever given you good fruits in the immediate. The reason is very simple, that the order that you are seeking to overthrow is so well entrenched, has so many factions and constituencies supporting it, that they have a direct vested interest in ensuring that the change does not happen. And because they have been in power for so long, they have all the support that they need to prevent change. But there is also nothing inevitable. I'm not going to, it would be ahistorical of me to say to you, but change is inevitable. I feel that change will happen. The change will happen due to the internal dynamics of each of the countries concerned. I believe that in all these countries, the present order is not sustainable, that it has exhausted its domestic value, and that the demands that the people now make upon their ruler, the present order is incapable of meeting those aspirations. And while they may seek to hang on for a while, and in some cases maybe for a longer while, I do not believe that it is going to continue for more than 10 years. Now, I believe that certain places the change will be faster than in certain others. In the case of, and I have a reason for each of them. Take Bahrain. You have a 70% community. You sustained a certain order up to now. Certain aspirations have emerged. They are not sectarian in character. They are a demand for political reform because you have an enlightened community. It is not sustainable for a regime to keep 70 to 80% of its people outside popular participation. Take the case of Kuwait. Kuwait has a constitution from 1962. It has an elected assembly. It has universal adult suffrage. What has happened is it has election upon election. It is knocking at the doors of constitutional monarchy. But because the Amir and his family are not willing to give up real power, they dissolve the assembly. How many times are you going to do that? In 5 years, they've done it 6 times. Now the opposition boycotted the assembly, these elections. But how long can it continue? So I believe that they are also separate from the Arab Spring, but now encouraged by it, you are going to see significant change in Kuwait. In the case of Oman, you have a ruler who has been ruling from 1970. He's a benign ruler, but this is the only GCC country that actually had street demonstrations. There were people who came out on the streets, they had certain demands of a political and economic character, and there was police firing and a few people were killed. Damage to property also occurred. Such a peaceful and benign country actually had demonstrations. I believe that the present order is not sustainable, and when the ruler hands over to his successor, he will not be able to maintain this order, so you will have a significant political change. The last country which we have to discuss is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as I have said, is a very difficult country. It's a different country. It's a unique country because it is ruled by a religious ideology. It is very, very powerful because it has now decided that in order to stem the tide of change, it's willing to go to war. It's absolutely ruthless in this. But is their order sustainable? This is the question. The answer, you ask Saudis and the Saudis will say it is not sustainable. Some of them asked me 2 years ago in Dubai, 3 prominent Saudi businessmen. They said, when do you think change will happen? So I said, in 10 years' time. So they said, you're completely wrong. Change will happen in the next 3 years. Now, whether it's 3 years or 10 years, I do not believe that the Saudi order is tenable, is sustainable. And therefore, but the problem with Wahhabiyya and the present order is that it does not provide for reform. It's like a fascist system. You either have a fascist system or you don't. Similarly with Wahhabiyya or a communist system, you cannot have reform within it and still continue authoritarian rule. The Chinese are trying to do it. It's proving to be extremely difficult. In Vietnam also it's extremely difficult. And the one that is giving way is the communist order, authoritarian order. Similarly, with regard to Saudi Arabia, you cannot sustain an authoritarian order based on religious coercion forever. There will be change. There is already a demand for change because today Saudi Arabia looks like an exceptional country. It's the only country in the world that doesn't allow driving by women. It's the only country in the world that has public executions with the sword. It is the only country in the world that has a religious police that has the right of intrusion. It has gender segregation of the kind that is seen as absurd. And it has serious distortions within its system because of that. So therefore, I believe overall that there is no way that you can sustain this. I therefore do not believe that the Arab Spring is halted. I think that the forces that have been unleashed cannot be wished away, cannot be fought against, cannot be purchased, and that over a period of time, between a period of 3 to 10 years, you are certainly going to see a lot of change. Another factor that is coming up, and that is something very new, and we have to watch it with great care, is the very dramatic US-Iran détente. You know, till recently, Iran was the pariah state. From 1979, it had an Islamic revolution, and it imprisoned so many of the American diplomats for 444 days. Therefore, it is a pariah nation for all this time. More than 30 years have passed. And of course, the Iranians have responded in kind, and therefore they have suffered sanctions. Now, with the election of a new leader, Rouhani, you find that the possibility of change has emerged. There could be a large number of reasons. Iran itself has been going through an internal debate of what kind of nation it should be 30 years after the revolution. Should it become even more rigid and doctrinaire in order to protect the revolution like Ahmadinejad did? Or can it afford to relax? Can it afford to be accommodative? Can it afford to reach out to other countries so that it can regain what is rightfully its own? And that is its geopolitical significance, its energy role, its political role in regional and world affairs as warranted by its history and its size, etc. All these are issues. In the case of Rouhani, he is the ideal candidate for this, to lead this change. Why? He's a cleric. Musavi, who fought the election in 2009, was secular, he's a cleric. Number two, he has been very close earlier to Khomeini and now to Khomeini. He got in the popular vote more than 51%, and 4 other candidates who stood against him, he got more than they all combined. He enjoys a unique stature. He has dealt with security issues all his life. He was the Supreme Leader's nominee on the National Security Council. So he has within him the capacity and the popular support to see through change. Will there be a dramatic change overnight? As the recent Geneva conference has shown, not at all. It is going to take time. There are issues on both sides. There are concerns on both sides. But at this stage, there is every reason to be extremely optimistic about the scenario. Now, if we were to look at the future, about the reason for my optimism, and I wish to close on that, is that in 2003, in the wake of the 9/11 events, then Crown Prince Abdullah issued a political manifesto. And I have given you just one paragraph from that manifesto which speaks of popular participation and reform. Now obviously this was put on the back burner, but there is a sensitivity about the need for change at the top. Now you could call it lip service, but I am personally convinced that there is enough resonance for this kind of thinking that is likely to continue. And another quotation that I have given, again from a Saudi newspaper, again which belongs to that period, where it was very clearly stated at that time, there was no distinction made between the republics and the traditional monarchies, that there is a popular demand for change, there is a popular desire for change, and this is not a desire that can be ignored or wished away. So this is the reason why I feel that we are going to see many painful developments and a few steps backward, but at the end, maybe in a 5 to 10 year time frame, we are likely to witness ourselves significant changes across the Arab world. I will pause at this point, and if there are any queries that you have, I'll be happy to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this enriching speech. So I'd like to ask people if they have any question to ask.
Considering overall scenario of Middle East, as you have explained everything, that there would be a lot of instability in the region. So how can we see business going on in this region? And what are the steps that Indian government has taken in order to protect the interests of Indian business in this region?
See, most of the business is centered, it emerges from oil and it is centered in the GCC countries. There is the really unstable countries, the three, truly unstable and to some extent insecure. There are only three of them, that's Iraq, Syria and Libya. All the others have reverberations, but there is no street fighting. Largely, normal life is proceeding there, normal economic and political activity is taking place. Look at the Gulf, the GCC. The GCC has, if you take GCC, Iran and Iraq, the Gulf has 2/3 of global oil reserves and at least 60% of global gas reserves, which is what has given them a special value and resonance. And in spite of the shale revolution in the United States, hydrocarbons, conventional hydrocarbons, are going to dominate the global economy. The US will be using shale basically to replace the depletion of the conventional fluid. But for the rest of the world, it will still be conventional. It will not have, shale revolution will not have a resonance. The difference will be that today Asia gets 60% of GCC exports of oil go to Asia. In 2035, it's going to be 90%. So China, Japan, Republic of Korea and India are going to depend on this region. This region is going to be extremely important for us. Also, if you look at the trade, there are two other parameters, trade and investment. In regard to trade, as you know from all three countries, the four countries that I mentioned, they have principal, very significant trade relations with the GCC. And if the sanctions were not there, they would have in Iran as well, because it's a major producer of oil. India, GCC is our #1 trade partner. Our trade with GCC is more than the trade that we have with the European Union combined. They're #1 in terms of country, #1 trade partner in the world is UAE. #1 export destination for India is UAE. So you can see the significance of this. Now, what is the role that India can play? We took a decision when the Arab Spring happened. There was brainstorming, a small group in which I was also a part. In June 2011, we were set up to prepare a document for the ministry as to what has happened and how should the government of India cope with it. We suggested that this is a product of intense internal debate, and therefore there is no scope for government of India to intervene either on one side or the other. We are a democratic country, we support democracy in any country, but we have never preached democracy because we believe that every country has a right to evolve its own political processes. So there is no sense of insecurity across the region. What most of the GCC have done is to ensure that their people do not agitate. My own sense is that if there is to be significant reform in the GCC countries, it will come from the top. Now, some people are skeptical about this and they suggest that they are not interested, the rulers are not interested in reform anyway. So top on, you have two kinds of change, as you know. From the bottom is when people agitate on the street and demand change, or from the top, where the rulers are enlightened and slowly open up the political process. There is a desire, there is a suggestion, very strong feeling that this change should come from above. And this is what we would be watching. But if you delay the change from above, you will lose your country you will lose your regime to the street. You will see that an attempt is being made to reform from above in Morocco and Jordan. both monarchies and the pressure from the people. They are giving certain political space to the opposition and all that. So now with regard to them, there is nobody who needs protection from government of India. Yeah, I mean, government of India needs to do anything to protect anybody physically. At this stage, that kind of crisis has not occurred. But having said this, of course, we watch every situation carefully. You have seen, we have been involved with the Iraq-Iran war, with the Iraq war in 1990, the Iraq war in 2003. We were involved also with the Libyan evacuation of our community. In all these crisis situations, Government of India has done very well by its community.
Good evening, sir. So recently, Saudi Arabia rejected the seat at the UN Security Council in order to protest against the US. So how do you think?
Sorry, or the nuclear?
The Saudi Arabia rejected the seat at the UN Security Council.
Yes, yes, yes.
So in order to protest against the US. So how do you think it's a favorable move or unfavorable move?
You see, Saudi Arabia has an infinite capacity to astonish. And I must confess, I spent 10 years of my life in that country and I remain astonished. Initially, they had rejected their turn to speak at the United Nations General Assembly. Their foreign minister refused to address the UNGA. And a few days later, when they won the Security Council seat that they had lobbied for several months, and the victory they celebrated, they suddenly rejected it. Most observers have seen it as a signal to the United States. You know, one of their prominent royal family members has actually, in case we missed the signal, they clarified that he said this is a message not for the UN, but for the US. So, what are they conveying to the US? They're conveying to the US that you are not sensitive to our concerns. And because you're not sensitive to our concerns, we reserve the right to sulk, to be petulant. So they are showing petulance. I told you, they are concerned about three things. You didn't do anything about Hosni Mubarak. What could the Americans have done about Hosni Mubarak? When the people have gathered, 500,000 people have gathered at Tahrir Square, what is the United States going to do to defend Hosni Mubarak if his own army doesn't stand with him? Are they going to shoot at those people? But this is the kind of Saudi sulk. Second, they say when General Sisi took over, you did not give him the full support. How can any foreign country, nobody gave full support, all of us were deeply embarrassed. I think it was a coup, it was a military coup against a legitimate government. The government may have made mistakes, but that doesn't mean that you have the right to overthrow the government. You have a right to correct what they have done, but you cannot overthrow them. So the Americans did not support the Sisi coup d'etat. And thirdly, they wanted the Americans to participate in the assault upon Syria, just like they had done with the Iraqis in 2003. Americans don't want to get into any of that because this assault doesn't stop with the assault. After the assault is the occupation. And when you have an occupation, you have feet on the ground. And the last thing the Americans want after their experiences in Syria, in Afghanistan and Iraq, the last thing they want is to have any feet on the ground anywhere in this region. So they held back. So it was a sign of petulance. Is this, most of us believe, I've read a wide variety of literature, that this is temporary. Because the Saudis, for the Saudis, their link with the United States is crucial for their national interest. They are otherwise extremely vulnerable. And as of now, there is no other ally in the world who can give them the kind of comfort and security that the Americans can. So after this display of petulance, you are likely to see a certain coming together. I have a medium-term plan. I have a vision for the medium term. And that is an alternative scenario completely. I feel that the United States' interest in sustaining a hegemonic role in the region is much less today than it was. Firstly, it's very expensive. It gets you embroiled in all kinds of local conflicts. It alienates popular opinion. And at the same time, you need this region a little less than you did before because, you know, you got your own oil. Of course, your allies still need the oil and there is still the security of Israel to be looked at and you still have to watch what the Iranians are up to. but you also have a greater, a deeper interest in what is happening in the Asia Pacific. And you have heard that the Americans now want to shift some of their attention to the Asia Pacific to watch the Chinese more closely. Now, in this scenario, over in the medium term, can we not work out a new security structure in the region? And I am a votary of that, and it is a cooperative security arrangement. You have three kinds of security arrangements regionally. You have a hegemonic, where you have one power that is extremely powerful, strong, and which can intervene militarily to ensure that things happen according to its own interest. You have a balance of power arrangement called realpolitik, where you have two sides which have equal power, they accommodate each other to a certain extent and ensure that because they are balanced, they don't go to war. This is the kind of arrangement you had roughly on the eve of the First World War. And roughly, very roughly, you had it during the Cold War. Now you have a cooperative security arrangement. It's not been worked out very well. There is only one precedent. This was during the Cold War between 1977 and 92. You had the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. 35 countries were members of this council. They used to meet regularly. They used to address a variety of issues. They used to build confidence building measures. Soviet Union and the United States were members. I am envisaging something like this for the Gulf. A cooperative security arrangement that embraces all the principal powers and the principal Asian powers that have a direct interest in the well-being of this region. China, Japan, Republic of Korea and India. What are the challenges? The challenges are to get an arrangement acceptable to the GCC that includes Iran, to have an arrangement which will satisfy the American, an Iranian included arrangement that satisfies the American. And then how do I get my 4 Asians to cooperate with me? You know, daunting challenges. But I feel, this is why I keep on stressing the medium term. And I'm not looking at government-to-government engagement just now. I'm looking at track 2, informal academic interactions, so that you build the ballast of this kind of thinking. One of the problems that we in Asia face is Asia just a geographical expression? Is there even a geographical expression that we agree upon? Is there a sense of Asia? Is there a nation vision? Is there a nation identity? Are we just on the wrong track? Yes, there is. When was Asia last? I was asked from the floor once, and I said the last time there was a sense of Asia was at the Russo-Japanese War, when the Japanese defeated the Russians in 1905. You had a sense of exultation across Asia, and you thought, and that ended with the Japanese occupation across Northeast and Southeast Asia and the atrocities they perpetrated. The Cold War further divided us, subdivided us, and we were at war with each other all through the Cold War. Therefore, Asia does not have a sense of cooperation, and there is no platform today anywhere where Asian countries sit together and discuss issues. There is an alphabet soup of a large number of sub-regional groupings like SAARC or ASEAN or Shanghai Cooperation or various GCC, but there is no Asia. So this is the challenge I face. But this is what I'm working towards. It's given a certain purpose to my present life to promote this kind of thinking, first through academic papers, then to consultations with the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans separately, then finally jointly, and then carrying them to meet our friends in the Gulf. And I do think that the Iran-US détente is a very, very helpful development. Again, Saudi-Iran relations are not cast in stone. If you look at the last 40 years, they've actually been pretty good friends, except for the last 2 years. And that is directly as a result of the Arab Spring. It doesn't have to do anything with what the Iranians have done. It is the Saudi way of handling the challenge of the Arab Spring is to demonize Iran. Okay, it's been there for 2 years. But before that, they were all right. So I suspect that as the relationship between Iran and the United States improves, there will be a direct vested interest in Riyadh to also not be left out, not be isolated, and to engage with Iran. And if that happens, already half my work is done. So that's what I'm looking at. If I'm going to get 90% of my oil from this region, and I have today 6.5 million people working there, and they sent back to India $35 billion. I think this region is pretty important for me. Yes, sir.
Sir, I think we are in a shortage of time.
One last.
Okay.
I told him to physically take me and put me in my car at 6:30. Whatever I may say or do. He's not done that. Ji, boliye.
So, what kind of business opportunity exists for Indian entrepreneurs in this changed political situation? Do Arabs have the soft corner for Indian businessmen?
See, your question is very straightforward. The answer is extremely complex and convoluted. Let me go very quickly. Number one, you must distinguish between the presence of Indians, the presence of Indian entrepreneurs, and the presence of the Indian corporate sector. So 3 different groups. Indians is the easiest. We are the number 1 community in the region, expatriate community. We are in the majority in at least 4 countries of the GCC. We are the preferred community. In every country of the GCC, we are number 1. In fact, we are so many, you don't know who is the number 2. In Oman, we are about 500 million or more. Second community is less than 100,000. In Kuwait, we are today 750,000. We don't know where the second community is. In Saudi Arabia, we are 2 million. In UAE, we are over 2 million. In both these places, we are over 2 million, let's say 2 million. We are looking at 6.5 million people. So Indians are there. The profile of the community has changed. In 1990, we were 90% blue collar and no professionals, statistically no professionals. 1990. By the time you come to 2010, you have the community has doubled in size, but you have 70% blue collar and 20% professionals and family members. Professionals and family members are 20%. There's a significant change again with regard to the profile. The second presence that we have is Indian entrepreneurs who set up businesses in the region. Some of them came from extremely humble backgrounds. 2 of the most distinguished people in the Gulf came from here. Mr. Muhammad Ali and Mr. Yusuf Ali. They are legends today. Mr. Yusuf Ali tells us frankly that he came as an illegal and swam into the thing and was at Hilawala at the beginning. He is today the number 1 Indian tycoon in the retail sector in terms of the Lulu chain. He has more than 100 Lulu outlets. Mr. Muhammad Ali is with Gulfar, number 1 construction company in Oman. Like this, you have a series of Indian businessmen, entrepreneurs. They are products of the oil revolution. But what about the earlier community? You had a community of Sindhis, Gujaratis and Kachis who were traders and who have been there for 150 years. So this is the Indian entrepreneurs, the Indian corporate sector. Where are they? Where do you don't even see them. In Saudi Arabia, we have not executed a major project in 30 years. The only place where you have some degree of presence of the Indian corporate sector is in Oman. They also is public sector led. We set up the Oman India fertilizer project. The change in the last 10 years has been in IT. Wipro, Infosys, etc. Then you will ask me why 10 years? Why not earlier? The Indian IT sector ignored the Gulf. They were hanging around in Europe and United States and Japan. Mr. Aziz Premji came to Riyadh when I was there the first time in 2003. He spent 1 day in Riyadh, and as he's leaving for the airport, he said, I wasted 5 years in Japan. I should have come here 5 years ago. So the Indian IT setup came much later than they should have. But having come now, they are doing quite well. Not the big project, but unfortunately, Mr. Board, you should be there as a pioneer. The other companies that have now started doing well are L&T. L&T came to the Gulf 15 years ago. They had a very hard time. It's a difficult, very challenging market, and all the Western companies are extremely well entrenched, and you are challenging them. But now they got a very large $400 million job in Medina to provide the railway lines. So I am very proud of their achievement because I saw them in year 2000 and they were nothing. They were doing one villa here, one small job here. Today in Oman, as you enter Muscat airport, you see the big road being done by L&T. L&T has also restructured and they have 6 or 7 verticals, each under a managing director. Each of them is doing business worth $1 billion. Something to be really proud of. The other companies are Punj Lloyd. Punj Lloyd is doing some pipe work. There is one company which is a very interesting and unique company, is Doctrinal. Doctrinal was a small consultancy company in the 70s, but it is owned by Walchand Hirachand Group. You know, the ancient, you see in the museum, Walchand Hirachand from Mumbai. Company went bankrupt. The family started dying. And suddenly one man survived, is Rajan Kelachand. He shifted to Dubai, became an NRI, and Doctrinal is today certified to do $1 billion jobs in the oil and gas sector. Now they have diversified into mining, etc. The other company is SR. They were tempted to come into hydrocarbon, but they resisted that temptation. There were too many problems, whatever. They focused on their own refinery at home. But they have come into telecommunications. And they are doing very well. They have also gone into mining. In Zimbabwe, they have got a mining concession for copper. And all the copper of Zimbabwe is now supposed to be mined by them. So they are doing extremely well. My company is the executor of oil and gas projects. We have come very recently. We find that there are very large number of opportunities because they are looking at upgrading their hydrocarbon sector very significantly, investing a lot of money. They're looking at $250 billion over the next 5 years. So a lot of jobs, a lot of projects are coming up. It's a great challenge for an EPC company because it's a very difficult market. There are already players there who've been there for 15, 20 years. So we've got a job recently in